Hello and welcome to another mod spotlight, this time over UbioZur Welding Ltd. Now this is a continuation from UbioZur's original work that has been done by Aluix and Gurkha2k. Thanks to them we have this mod back up and working. Now what UbioZur Welding does is it basically lets you take one part, or I should really say many parts, and make it into one part. So if I were to take, let's make something a little more practical. So here I have a simple little fuel tank setup. Of course, we have 6 of these fuel tanks and a couple of adapters, so it all fits in a 1.25 meter stack. Now what UbioZur Welding does is it allows us to take this, select the part branch, which we then just have to control click, and you can control click on any part, it highlights it in purple for you. I'm going to control click on the root part, so the whole thing's highlighted. This is all of the parts that I want to weld, and you push weld it. Now you're going to give a few options: the name, the title, and how exactly you want to categorize it. Now the name is actually the folder name that this part gets saved into, like the config files inside the game data folder. So we're just going to call this a 6X fuel tank, and the name, which is the name that will appear inside the VAB, such as these parts over here, each have their own name. We can just call this large welded fuel tank. Now since it's a fuel tank, I'm going to change its category to fuel tank, and you can actually choose the required tech. Although the tech doesn't matter. If you want to make it the most advanced tech where the parts are located, then you can just select the bottom one, or the most basic, then you can just select near the top for the parts being used. Like, which part do you need to have unlocked before you can unlock this piece inside a career mode. Now, by default the settings will just accumulate everything, so it adds the mass of all the parts to get the total mass, it adds the cost of all the parts to get the total cost. The temperature, I believe, is the average, as well as some of the physics forces. It tells you what modules are on it, which is modular fuel tanks is there because I have that mod installed, as well as the other one is probably another mod, but the modules are things like landing legs, docking ports, lights, and you can only have one type of each part, and I'll show that in a little bit. As for the resources, it's accumulation of all 6 tanks. So each tank can only hold so much liquid fuel and oxidizer. Since there are 6 tanks, it's accumulating all of it and saying this is how much resource our part is going to have. So we can also set a description if we want. I just accidentally skipped over that. Warranty void during re-entry. Well, since it's unlikely this part will actually make it to re-entry, we'll just warranty void. Sounds like a safer choice. Then you click save, new part saved and shipped. Okay, now it just deleted the part, and I have it set to do that, so don't be worried, your part is saved even though it deletes it. Now in the settings is where you can actually tell it to do this. Include all nodes, meaning it will include every single node on the part. So for this piece, for example, I'm actually going to stick another one of these on, just to try and demonstrate this. When you tell it to include all nodes, it's going to include 4 nodes for each part. Even though this is an open node, that's an open node, and then there's another open one and another open one, these nodes are currently closed because they are being used. When you tell it to include all nodes, it's going to actually open up these, so you'll be able to connect to these nodes that are closed, connected to each other on the welded part. So it's not really necessary to do unless you want to, more aesthetics really, being able to connect to nodes that are already connected to something. Don't process massless parts means it does not add them to the averages. The massless parts will drastically change the physics of the object, the part. Database auto reload, I only suggest doing this if you are running stock KSP with no other mods installed. If you have other mods installed, the database will not reload properly, and most of the time you're going to come back to the VAB with nothing in it at all, and you're going to have to restart your game. use named parts file, which is what I just showed, where I was able to name my part, which was the first option I had. Advanced debug, clear editor after welding, that's why it deleted it. Sometimes after you weld the part, the pieces will act a little strange, so I just like to clear the editor. And of course you can choose how things are calculated, such as the strength is the averages, the temperature is the lowest temperature, or you can of course say, weighted average, arithmetic mean, which is the middle. So those are just what each of the settings really mean. Now I'm going to close out of this because I'm going to show you the part that I just welded. Now, like I said, the part is not going to be here. And that's because the database has not accepted it yet. It's like if you were to install a mod while KSP is running, you're not going to see that mod until you restart KSP. Now when you reload the database, you can do it in a couple of ways. You can restart KSP altogether, or you can hit Alt F12, go to database, and click reload all. This is going to reload the database and allow you to get the new parts that were created. Now that I've reloaded my database, I should have this new part in the fuel tanks section. And it should have its own custom image that looks like the welded part. There it is right here. Large welded fuel tank. Warranty void. Of course the manufacturer is UbioZur Welding Ltd. Now this is one part. So if I right click it, you can see it's got the entire liquid fuel, the entire oxidizer, it's got the accumulation of all of the other parts. So it's exactly the same amount of mass, amount of fuel, as if I had all the parts separate. The only difference is now this is one part. Now this is can be beneficial and also sometimes a hazard. Say if I were to nudge this part, this adapter node, a little too hard up in space when I was trying to dock something. If I hit this a little too hard and this piece broke, the whole thing would break. Even though hitting this piece alone, these tanks should survive, it's one part now. So now if anywhere on it gets destroyed, the whole thing goes. However, it is beneficial because this used to be 8 parts. So if I want to take the same physics stress as if I were to use 8 parts, then I can now use 8 of these. So let's just stack 7 of them around it, I guess. There. Now I'm using 8 parts. The exact same part count as I was using previously, except now I have 8 times the fuel. And also, if I wanted to, of course, I could take this and go, yeah, I like this. Let's weld it. You are able to weld parts, and once you've welded parts into another part, you can weld the welded parts. I hope that makes some sense. Now if you just skip over clicking part branch, it's going to select the root branch by default, which is the first piece you place in the VAB. And here we go. Now we can name this again, something like super fuel tank, and spell fuel wrong as we should. And my welded part, we'll just call this a bigger fuel tank. We'll put it in fuel tank again. It's got 17,280 liquid fuel with 21,120 oxidizer. And of course we can tell this to save. And the new part was saved, so we will have access to it later. Alright, so I have gone and reloaded the database, so we can see that now this much larger fuel tank part is indeed working, and of course it's got all the nodes on the top and bottom. So just a simple fuel tank and structural part is working. Now I've also gone ahead and created a couple of other parts that work a little bit differently. Now this one has a single engine on it, as you can tell, and I've also gone ahead and created another couple of parts, such as this smaller fuel tank with 3 engines on the side, and a couple parts down in structural, such as these. And we're going to go over each of them. Let's start with this one. So I'm going to grab it, put on a module, throw Bob in there, and I'm going to hit launch. There's not going to be a need for a launch clamp because this will be a pretty quick test. Okay, so we're going to turn SAS on, throttle up, and fire the engine. Now you're going to notice this is going to work. This is all one part. Now it's overheating just because of another mod I have installed, so pay no attention to that. Now this is a fuel tank and an engine all in one part. As you can see, I can shut down the engine and it turns off, and I can reactivate it. I can also toggle gimbal and see the liquid fuel and oxidizer. Now I'm just controlling the throttle a little bit. Of course I can also control the thrust limiter. So if I want to, I can control it this way. And you can see that this is working properly. Of course, until the thing actually overheats. And then it doesn't work too well when it explodes. So only certain types of engines, when welded to other parts, are going to work properly. Now, a lot of the times they'll be buggy and they won't work very well, and I have not tried this with docking parts such as this being a fuel tank and an engine at the same time. I have not tried docking it to other parts or other welded parts, so I'm not too sure what would happen. However, as it stands alone, the fuel tank and engine is one unit. Only when there is one engine will it work. And I say only while there's one engine because I am going to go ahead and dump this here and grab another one of these parts. Now, just by looking at this, you can probably tell it's not going to work. And that's because this piece is another welded part, so it's a single unit, and instead it's using 3 of these smaller engines. Now when I welded it, these two closed because this part is supposed to only be able to have one engine. One part is only able to have one engine on top of it, such as if we go into engines and I were to pick out, say, an SRB, I could safely say that this SRB right here only is one engine. Now if this SRB said it was 3 engines, then it might be strange. So one part can only really be one engine. So when you weld 3 engines into one part, there's only one engine, and that causes 2 of them to close off. However, the 2 closed off ones will make it so this thing does not work at all. And how about we demonstrate this? So we're on the launch pad, and if you notice already, there's something not right. First off, there's this animation over here of 3 engines firing. Secondly, we don't have any stages, and thirdly, when I hit spacebar, I can't do anything. Now even when I right click on this, it says I have liquid fuel, it says I have oxidizer, spacebar doesn't do anything. Let's try to jettison. Still nothing? What about activating the engine? Well, now the engines are active and they're actually draining fuel. There's that overheating again. However, the engines still aren't here. I still have no control over them. And that's just the overheat exploding it. So, I'm going to revert the flight and try this one more time. Except now, I'm just going to move this over. I'm going to activate the engine first. That way it starts draining fuel, and then we'll try to jettison it, see if there's any difference in which comes first. And it appears there's no change, that these 3 engines just are not going to work. Now, this is not the only design of this that is not going to work. If you try to do anything else, such as I attempted to build this piece over here, this piece did not work either. So if we just make it so it's completely opaque, as you can see, these 2 engines still have that, as though there's a part beneath them. They have that shell that prevents them from actually working, and that's because I welded this all into one part with 3 separate engines. Now, I'm going to show you something strange. This only really affects the stackable engines. So if I were to go back to my fuel tanks tab and go to an engine I showed a little bit earlier, which was this one, this engine actually works. And we will show this in just a moment. Now, I can't say for certain why exactly these radial engines will actually work, but they just so happen to. As you can see, we launch, and all 3 of them are firing. The animation, which is what I was expecting to definitely be wrong, is actually quite correct for the 3 engines, the same type of engine, 3 different engines, and they're burning fuel. Now, the fuel consumption seems a little wrong, actually. I feel as though it should be burning at a steady rate, however it is not. So even though they work, and they work for the most part properly as an engine, they're not consuming fuel at the right rate. It looks like they're consuming liquid fuel at the rate of the 3 engines would, but oxidizer at the rate of only 1 engine would consume oxidizer. So that's a bit strange, actually. Now, even though these engines work, and they even gimbal correctly, by the way, if you see that. Now, even though these engines do work, I still will not recommend using them. Welding engines, I mean. Because when you weld engines, strange things happen. For example, this oxidizer thing, where we've only used a small portion of the oxidizer that we have in total, whereas we've used all of the liquid fuel. Why that happened? I honestly couldn't say. Must just be a bug with welding the pieces together. So, like I said, I still do not recommend ever welding engines. You can just add them on after you welded the fuel tank or structural part, or even batteries is another good example, which I'll show in just a minute, how welding batteries together can be really helpful. But for the most part, I just recommend using this mod to weld structural pieces that don't actually have any active functions. Okay, so I've set up this little demonstration to really show the power of being able to weld parts. Now, this spaceship, this battery bank, has very few parts, because these are a battery bank that I made out of some of the large ones and some of the little radial attach ones. Now, if we go to the map and I open up the info tab, we can see that this has 38 parts. This has a 38 part count and is running relatively smooth. Now, though it's mostly in the yellow on the physics, it does flicker green, so it's just on the border between green and yellow if you're watching it. And because it's on this border, this wouldn't be too hard to dock with. Say if we were to have another vessel and we were trying to dock with a station. 36 parts, that's not too bad for physics warp. Now, let's go over to the other station, which, unfortunately, is not so few parts. It's the exact same vessel, except it's not using welded pieces. It's using the stock pieces all stacked together. And here is the masterpiece, or really, this awful thing. Once I can get it to stop lagging. Okay, so it's the exact same vehicle. If you notice, the physics warp is much worse. It takes several seconds for 1 second to go by. And that is primarily because when we go to our info tab and we look at the part count, it's 1,083 parts. The exact same mass, but now it's over 950, more than 1,000 parts more actually. Yeah, more than 1,000 parts more just because I didn't weld it. Although it's exactly the same mass. And it's exactly the same electrical charge storage. Except now they're just individual parts. And each individual part has to calculate physics warp. Or not physics warp, but just the KSP physics altogether. And since each individual part is calculating its own physics, that means the timer is going by much, much slower. And I'm sure if I tried to actually put thrusters on this thing and move it, it would be even worse. Or try to dock to it, it would be insanely difficult. Whereas this smaller station over here, that's only using a few parts, would be much easier to dock to, and the game would be much more fond of actually allowing this thing to do something. Because this is so many fewer parts, although it has exactly the same purpose and capacity. since these electric charges are just the sum of the block. So exact same station, exact same purpose, significantly less parts, significantly easier on physics, etc. So that's just an example of where this mod can really be useful. Now back in the VAB, I just want to make a little note that I pointed out a bit earlier, and that's unique parts. So if I were to take just a fuel tank and I wanted to weld it to something, say some landing legs, then it would be fine if I were to use one leg and then maybe attach this to some other assembly as the lander where it's got many legs. However, if I were to say more than just one leg, say I wanted 4 legs, this would be a problem with the welding. Kerbal Space Program has a limitation on what it can handle, and 4 legs as one part is one of those limitations, such as when you weld this, it becomes a single part, as I've demonstrated. Now, when 4 legs become a single part, the part says that it's a leg, and when 4 legs say they are one leg, I'm sure that's when issues can arise, such as when 4 equals 1. That would make anyone who has a simple understanding of math a little crazy. So it's just a limitation. If you want to have 4 legs like this, don't weld them. Just leave them off the vehicle, or weld one on to the part, because if you try to weld more than one of components such as legs or lights, docking ports even, it's not going to work at all. It's not going to operate the same. It might work, it just will not work properly, such as the engine welded to a fuel tank that I demonstrated earlier. A couple other notes that are mentioned on the forum page is parachutes do not work at all, and wings, if you try to weld them together, wings and aerofoils start to have issues with how they operate. They basically just stop working. Of course, the full list of what doesn't work properly can be found on the forums, which is in a link in the description of this video. Now, on a very final note about different modules, the legs do not work together when there's many of them there, and neither will some unique parts from other mods, such as a carbonite drill. The carbonite drill has the same issue with the legs, where the one part is told that it's a carbonite drill, yet you have 4 carbonite drills on the one part that is one carbonite drill. Again, it's just that issue that KSP has a limitation for, so special parts like that won't work. Same with anything like electromagnets from Kerbal Attachment System. All of these unique parts will typically not work if you put more than one on, and if you put a variety of them on, say you only put one, then you're telling a single part that okay, you're a drill. At the same time you're a drill, you are going to be a solar panel, all while being a Kerbal Attachment System container and a Kerbal Attachment System magnet. Now when you put all of the stuff on like this, I can almost guarantee you that weird stuff will happen, since a single part is being defined as so many different parts. Anyhow, that brings us to the end of this mod spotlight over UbioZur Welding Ltd. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This is PTTGRW, signing out.